Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Hello. Hi. What's going on, guys? Hope challenge cracking is going well. Hope you're finding those flags. As our first special presentation of the day, I would like to invite up to the stage James Perry, the security lead at AWS for public sector customers, who has also previously served as the CISO at University of South Carolina, Columbia. So let's give a warm NJIT Jersey CTF 4 welcome to James Perry. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon. Who's got a flag so far? All right. Good job. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm excited to engage with this group. As I was thinking about sort of this presentation and the audience, I had to think back to my time at the university and being an adjunct faculty member and what actually this audience would be interested in. So I'll keep this brief and hopefully somewhat entertaining for you as well. I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to lead a global team for public sector at AWS and for Amazon at large, where our mission statement says that we want to be Earth's most customer-centric company, and the way that we sort of think about that across all of our businesses is, if we do things that give price, selection, and convenience to our customers, it helps the business grow. The reason I mention this is that I have the opportunity to work for one of the most innovative companies in the world. Yet, when I was talking to my daughters about this and the fact that we're constantly releasing innovative features and capabilities to help government customers, education institutions, and so forth, they reminded me that you all probably would look at a speaker like myself as a boomer, all right? So what I wanted to do today, there's really three things that I want you to take away from this conversation, if nothing else. One is that the choice to learn about cybersecurity and pursue a career is a great choice. There's tons of opportunity for you. And in this, I want to share a couple key things that you'll want to think about as future cyber practitioners that will help you deal with the potential burnout and some of the challenges that go with the roles. Second thing is, when you get those opportunities your first employment opportunities and you land in an organization, there are going to be unique challenges that you face in the culture of the companies and the organizations that you work with. And what are a couple successful things that you can do to establish yourself in those organizations and help drive security in your future employment? And then the last thing is we'll talk about a couple benefits of the cloud and how you can use that to deal with emerging threats. All right, so one of the things that I engage with a lot of customers around the world, and one of the key things that they talk about when they think about cybersecurity is there's really three challenges that they face. Number one is most organizations' IT departments don't have enough budget. Second, they don't have enough cybersecurity professionals on their teams. And third, even if they do have those professionals, they don't have the budget to get them all of the training and education that they want. So your ability as a future employee to come to that environment and into that interview process with having those skills, having those experiences, will help differentiate you in the interview process. Now, interestingly enough, Deloitte and NASCIO did a study a couple years ago, and they asked CISOs what was the number one barrier to achieving security within their organization. And number one at the top there you see is a lack of staff and resources. So the second problem that we see is around supply versus demand. If you look at something like cyberseek.org, today it says that the US alone only has 72% of the cyber talent that is needed by our companies and government and critical infrastructure organizations. And so that means that two out of every 3 positions that a company needs, they're able to fill. Now, I don't know what the grading scale is at NJIT or at other organizations, but what is a 72? Is that a D? C? Okay. Is a C good enough in cybersecurity? No. Okay. So one of the challenges we have is just having enough talent. Now, the other problem that we have is that because there's so a limit in the talent that's available, a lot of cyber practitioners deal with burnout in their role. And so what that looks like is you see a lot of opportunity in open roles. Today, there's an estimated 572,000 open cyber jobs in the US alone. And you see almost 1.2 million that are employed. So what that means is that as employees have experienced burnout in their roles, there's an opportunity out there waiting for them to move on. And so the tenure of cyber professionals at companies, you see a lot of folks moving from organization to organization as a way to deal with that burnout. Interesting, last year, Tynes published a report called Voice of the SOC 2023, and they found that 63% of cyber professionals in a security operations center environment experience some level of burnout. And they attributed that 50% of the SOC teams identified the problem of being understaffed, and having 81% noted that the workload and the demand for their time and the projects that were on their plate was increasing. So sort of that idea of do more with less and that constant pressure. So this is what I think the challenge is that a lot of organizations have, and this is something that when I was the CISO for the university that we dealt with, is that if you think about all of the security products that are out there that an organization might implement, a significant percentage of the security team's time is often spent in the procurement process trying to identify which solution they want to buy, how does it integrate with existing investments, how do I normalize all of the event sources and data that's coming from these different security devices and tools, bring that together into a cohesive strategy and technical platform, and then feed that to my security operations team. And as you can imagine, that's a very complicated process when it's sort of best of breed, buying individual products and figuring out how to put them together. And I know in my case at the University of South Carolina, I had a team of 13 folks in my security operations center. 7 of those folks were dedicated to nothing more than ETL processes related to log sources, trying to normalize the data to bring it into our SIM tool so that our analysts could actually look at events. And anytime one of those tools changed or upgraded, it often meant we had to go back and redevelop a parser in order to bring that event source into the SIM. So a lot of manual work. The other problem that I think we see is if you think about how you, as a security analyst, would deal with vulnerability assessments and the identification of a vulnerability in the market. Let's say a new CVE comes out today. What is the process that you take to identify if you have that vulnerability in your environment? A lot of organizations struggle with asset management and even knowing what resources are available in the infrastructure. So even once you sort of identify what assets you have and you look at, do I have this application or this vulnerability in my environment, then you have to figure out how do I remediate it, which patch do I use, how do I roll that out to production, and the process of doing that is very, very time-consuming and manual. And if you look at the chart that's on the screen here, you'll see the number of vulnerabilities that have been released year over year continues to increase, with over 26,000 new vulnerabilities documented in 2023 alone. And so if your process is manual and resembles sort of what I talked about before, it's very, very difficult to be effective at scale. All right. So this leads to that SOC burnout that we spoke about a few minutes ago. And these are the top 5 causes why security practitioners felt burnout and the challenges that they identified as what gave them frustration. Number one was spending time on manual work. Number two was too many different consoles, too many different tools to investigate an incident. The cost of those tools being too expensive and prohibitive for their organization to use them. Lack of a unified query language to be able to access data across all of the different tools. And then poor integration of security tools in their environment. All of that sort of summarized would be a lot of manual work and lack of integration that makes it difficult for you as a practitioner to focus on what's important, which is actually looking at incidents and responding to things rather than figuring out how to make your tools work. So this is part of what I think the cloud offers as a solution, is to help minimize this manual work, help bring automation, and improve the way in which security teams work. Now, an interesting slide here. If you had to think about what the 5 most common security issues were that cloud customers identified in the last couple of years were, these are the top 5 root causes for why a security incident happened for a customer of ours. Loss of security credentials. So this is developers publishing access keys and or usernames and passwords in source files and posting them out to GitHub or other software repositories. Insecure resource configuration. You know, I deployed a virtual machine on EC2, but didn't follow through with patching or enabling best practices and hardening those instances. They may have actually even had threat intelligence working with a service like GuardDuty, and they actually might have gotten an alert, but the analyst that received the alert didn't respond to the incident and missed the alert. Or a lack of continuous vulnerability management. So we spoke a minute ago about the volume with which patches are being released and CVEs are being identified, the inability to keep up with that at scale. And lastly, unmanaged applications and the security around those. Now, having formerly been at a university, one of the challenges I faced was really, really smart graduate students like yourselves that worked on a project, would go to Surplus, get hardware, build some solution and application and deploy it for the university as part of a research project or that, and then you all graduate and leave those resources behind, and someone often isn't aware that they're there on the network and forget to maintain it. So how do we, as security practitioners, then think about that? One of the, as the burnout we sort of talked about is manual processes and, the challenge of not having enough resources. Then when you think about you taking that first job with an employer, how do you be successful at building a culture of security and creating an environment where you are successful as a professional and you're also able to influence the direction in which your organization moves forward? So I think the key principle here, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is that security is everyone's responsibility. Oftentimes we think about just the security team or the IT department being the one that's responsible for this, but we have to figure out how to have every end user in the organization take responsibility for security. And it's important to note that a culture of security is not the same thing as security culture. Often we think about the security department building a security culture, but it takes everyone in the organization to build a culture. And so we'll talk a little bit about a couple examples of what that might look like. Now, in order to be successful at this, you have to have common beliefs, values, and behaviors that create that culture of society or culture of security. And so this is sort of the journey that a lot of organizations move through. It starts with someone in IT having security responsibility. So you may get that first job, go to work with this organization, and realize that the organization only has 1 or 2 security folks in the security team, and you're responsible for all of it. So how do you then sort of work over time to grow that responsibility to where you build a security team? And then as the security team matures and you have other application owners and business owners extend that security responsibility to those folks that are developing new applications or running business units, and eventually get it to where all users have and accept the responsibility that they have. So in order to do that, it sort of takes three key ingredients. The first is executive support. The second is distributed ownership, and the third is psychological safety. So I'll dig into each of those just briefly. So this is Andy Jassy, who's the CEO for Amazon.com. And he says, and it's common that we say at AWS, that security is job zero. And so an example of that is a program that I'll tell you about today that we call Security Guardians. So if you think about AWS as a company, today we have over 200 services that we offer to customers. And each of those services have a dedicated team of developers, product managers that build out those services and capabilities. And they operate independently with autonomy. We call that sort of a two-pizza team. And so when you think about how do you build security and enforce security across a very distributed organization like that, we've used this program called Security Guardians. And the way that looks is that in a team of developers, we'll designate one of those developers as a security guardian and give them responsibility for building a threat model for the application or the feature that they're working to build. And in that threat model, they're expected to look at what are the risks that this particular application has as part of its capabilities and features. And then they're required to present that a data flow, an architectural drawing of the service and its features, and how they intend to mitigate the risks that they identify through threat modeling. That guardian then works with the AWS Central Security team to review that risk assessment that they've done for a new service or feature. And the two of those teams together have to approve and agree that all of the security issues that they've reviewed and identified have been remediated to the level that's acceptable with AWS's security policies. And so it's an example of shared responsibility where the developers that are building new services have responsibility for the security of their service, but there's a central team that has responsibility for providing oversight and reviewing the security before it's allowed to go into production. And so when you look at AWS and you think about the blog posts, the open source projects that we publish out on GitHub, white papers, all of those things where we release sample codes in solution libraries, we provide sample code in documentation, all of those artifacts that we publish are required to go through a security review process like this before we publish them so that our customers and users inherit that security code. And as a result of this program, we've seen over 2,000 software developers be upskilled to become security guardians, where security wasn't part of their responsibility before, and we've extended that responsibility to them. It's resulted in 22.5% less security findings that were identified during the application security review, and it's resulted in 26.9% faster review processes, which means that as we develop new features and services, we're able to get them out to customers faster. And the second thing I want to talk about, and this is a question for the audience here, if you had to think about Amazon's Security Operations Center, how would you describe that? Like, what would you imagine? Big room full of monitors, lots of screens, blinking lights, maps, a sea of people, sort of a room like this, right? Would it shock you if I told you we don't actually have one? So a company with 1.5 million employees, $1 trillion business, doesn't have a traditional security operations center. The reason is that we realized, as we've already spoken about, we don't have enough security talent, and there's not enough security talent available to staff that type of an operation. There aren't enough of you to facilitate that. So how do we solve for that? Through automation and through mechanisms like a correction of errors process. So I'm sure you've all heard this term before, never let a good crisis go to waste, by Winston Churchill. So if you think about how do you weaponize that statement from a security strategy perspective, An example is what we call corrections of errors. So in this case, if you think about, we've identified a security incident that's happened somewhere in the business. Security team responds to and does an investigation, does forensics, looks at logs, does whatever it does to investigate that issue. And they're required to write a report that outlines all of the details of what the issue was, how we detected it, why it was possible that that happened, why that was possible, and they're expected to get to the root cause of the problem, whether it's a policy, a technical configuration, or something else. And the key piece here is that in order for them to close out that error, they have to have a plan that's approved by leadership that includes automation. It's how will we detect this in the future with canaries? How will we build something different in our unit test plans? How will we ensure that this particular issue doesn't happen again? And how do we ensure that when the issue, if this similar issues are detected in the future, that we escalate this to the environment, out to our end users? One thing that's really unique about Amazon's culture is, I mentioned earlier, 1.5 million employees, is we've built a culture of escalation. So what does that look like? When we detect something with automation, so let's say an end user within the Amazon company deploys an S3 bucket and it's publicly made available, which is a violation of our security policy, that's automatically detected with one of these canaries that were built out of this process, and it automatically creates a ticket and routes it to the owner of that bucket for immediate resolution. So they get an email note saying you've had a ticket cut, and the magic of the process is that if that ticket hasn't been acknowledged and remediated within 30 minutes, it gets escalated to their manager. And if that manager hasn't responded to it and it hasn't been remediated within 30 minutes, it goes to their manager. So within about 5 hours of a security incident being identified, or a security issue, I should say, and that ticket being cut, if it's not been resolved, it ends up as an alert to the CEO of the company, and no one wants that to happen. So what you see is a culture of employees that when there's a security alert or finding, the folks that work for the company are very, very fast, and like that's the highest priority, is to go look at that and resolve it. And so through a mechanism like this, where everyone is responsible and they've accepted that, we've been able to drive tremendous automation to where we don't need that security operations center, where we're bringing thousands and thousands of log sources in to have them manually inspected. We're using machine learning and AI and other techniques with heuristics and things like that, and signature matching and so on, to identify and automate the remediation of those findings, which essentially allows us to scale faster. Now here's the fun part. Every week we have a security meeting with all of our product teams where they're expected to attend, and when you think about 200 of those teams, there's no way that in one meeting every team can present their security review, talk about what they're doing from security metrics and all of those kinds of things. So we've implemented sort of what we call the wheel of death, and essentially every team is expected to show up to that meeting prepared to talk about the security of their service, what they're working on, and what their metrics and KPIs are indicating. And we spin a virtual wheel that randomly picks a couple different service teams in the room, and then they are expected to present their findings that week. So you have to show up to the meeting prepared to discuss your findings, and you never know if you're the one that has to speak or not that week. So what it drives the behavior of is that everyone shows up, has looked at their metrics, they've worked to remediate issues, and it's a way to sort of drive that culture of ownership and responsibility for security. Now, in terms of psychological safety, I mentioned that we're a culture of escalation. You have to create a situation where there are no consequences for reporting something in error. We would rather folks open up a support case, report a finding to the security team, and investigate it and find out that it was a false positive than the opposite. And so we've built a culture where we tell folks all the time, report, 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 escalate, escalate, escalate. If you see something, say something. And so we want to, encourage all of our end users to do that as a normal part of our culture. So the other thing is that we want to make things as easy as possible. I'm sure at some point in your academic career you might have looked at a research study that Vanderbilt University did several years ago about cyber fatigue. And the outline of the research was that the more decisions that you put on end users to make the right decision, at some point they give up and say, there's no way that I can think of and do all of these security steps that you've asked me to do, so I'm not even going to try. And so what we want to do here is make security by default, and make it very difficult for folks to do the wrong thing in the way that we deploy systems and applications. All right, so now I want to finish up sort of here with sort of three kind of predictions as you think about where the cybersecurity market's heading towards and what are some of the key trends and things to be thinking about. One is that security is going to be integrated into everything we do. We see a shift from the self-managed on-premises sort of traditional deployment of IT resources to a shared responsibility using in the cloud. And why does that matter? If you think about building a data center, deploying servers and storage and networking and all of the things that go into building an IT operation, and you match that up against a compliance framework like something like NIST 800, there are over 1,700 security controls that are in that framework. And an organization that builds this on their own has to think about, review the risks of, review the implementation of all of those controls. Whereas if they leverage the cloud, they inherit many of those things through the shared responsibility model and the services that they leverage from a cloud provider. If you think about the capture the flag that you're doing today, you're working on simulations that are running in a cloud data center somewhere that you didn't have to build. You don't have to think about the electric, the backup, how the compute was set up, the storage, any of that. All you had to do was go into an interface, issue an API call, and voila, you've got a virtual machine. All of the configuration and the security controls that support that are managed by AWS. So organizations, as I kind of spoke about earlier, that are struggling with how do I get enough cyber talent, can leverage managed services and solutions like cloud to minimize the amount of assessments and things that they have to do. And this is a way that they can scale and move faster to deploy mission-sensitive applications and so forth. The other thing that they're able to do, we sort of talked about that whole patch management problem, is the ability to do continuous security and compliance. So imagine a future where a new vulnerability is released into the CVE database, and when that vulnerability is added to the database, it triggers automated workflow that goes out and runs a vulnerability assessment scan of your entire infrastructure. And then those instances where that vulnerability or that patch is missing, it automatically patches it, and then you and the security operations team gets a notification that, hey, this application was patched last night because a vulnerability was released to the database. Or every time a new instance is spun up, when it's spun up for the first time, that vulnerability assessment happens as part of the normal process. That type of automation and event-driven security really allows security teams and organizations to scale and move faster and in a more secure way. So we see a lot of companies and organizations moving in that direction. And so instead of this big picture of building blocks and Legos that you have to figure out how to do, by leveraging the cloud, customers are able to basically get predefined prescriptive services that are built to work together, standardized, and sort of drive that event-driven security. And as a result of that, we've done some studies about the benefit that customers see from a return on investment perspective. And as cloud maturity increases from low to medium to high, we see cost savings, better staff productivity, better resiliency, business agility, and so these are sort of some quantified values that organizations see through that. And as a result of sort of this, this sort of culminated is just a great example. Last year, the White House published the National Cybersecurity Strategy Update, and there was a key statement that I'll share here is that cloud-based services enable better, more economical cybersecurity practices, leading to better operational resiliency. So large governments, including the US and those around the world, have sort of recognized that in order to meet their mission requirements in order to be able to deploy IT solutions faster, and to do so in a more secure way, they're leveraging the cloud. Now, the second thing that hopefully you're paying attention to is the growth in quantum computing and the implications of it. So what we expect is that the traditional encryption algorithms and protocols that we use today are not going to be sufficient for once quantum computing becomes reality, and they're not going to provide the privacy and the protection that we need. So reconsidering sort of those classical algorithms and working to develop new ones that are quantum proof is a significant investment that AWS and other companies are working on. And so that's why you'll see AWS has a service called Bracket that enables customers and other folks in research to begin working with quantum computing. And you'll see that AWS and Amazon has been active in the community proposing new cryptographic algorithms around quantum that meets the security requirements of the future. And then third is the area around AI ML, and I'm sure everyone's heard about this thing called Gen AI. No joke, no laugh there. Seems like it's everywhere, right? But we see the predictive capabilities of AI ML being used to better improve proactive security. So a lot of our tools, when you think about the Security Operations Center and sort of what the events and things that folks are getting today, being able to take generative AI in tools like Amazon Detective and look at all of those events, summarize them into a single narrative, then give the analyst a summary of all of the events that were identified, and then quickly helping them triage and respond to the events. We also see AI/ML in things like provable security. So when you think about hardware security and the hardware root of trust, leveraging things like provable security to ensure that even the boot process of the hardware is secure, and that the hardware security module that's used to build the encryption can be trusted. And so you see a lot of innovation and investment in areas like that, both from AWS and other folks in the community. All right, so on generative AI, a couple key things here is that, and actually I'll just move on to the OWASP Top 10. There's really kind of two security models that I would mention. There was recently one released on OWASP Top 10 for large language models. If you haven't had an opportunity to look at that, definitely something to think about. And the key here is that there was a recent study to where 65% of end users that have an organization that has a policy that says you can't use things like ChatGPT with our company's data admitted that they violated the company policy and they were doing it anyway. So if you think about you're in an organization that manufactures products and you have intellectual property that are unique to your company, or perhaps you're a healthcare provider and you've got patient data, or there's some other data that has value to your company and employees are intentionally releasing that in order to better workflow for their job in writing a report, what is the impact of that data being lost or potentially exposed to external entities? But on the flip side, as we sort of talked about, there's pluses and minuses to this. It certainly is going to help security improve and find adversaries faster, better summarize and drive innovation from a security practitioner perspective, but there's also risk associated with it. The other is we've seen cases now where in trials where lawyers and legal teams have reported case law that was generated from AI, and upon investigation, the case law that was quoted was generated by an AI prompt. There was actually no such case law. So the integrity of the results and ensuring that you've got appropriate processes in how your business or your organization uses that data, and you're putting appropriate security controls around that, is going to be really, really important as we move forward. All right, so with that, I will wrap up and say, just in conclusion, really three important things. Picking a profession in cybersecurity is a great choice. There are tons of opportunities, over 500,000 available today in just the US. Every organization wants your services. The key thing that I mentioned early on was that a challenge that your future employer has is that they often don't have the budget to send you to the training that you're going to need. So the work that you're doing now as a student to get exposure to vendor products like Splunk and CrowdStrike and leverage the free trainings and opportunities to engage with that is going to give you a competitive advantage in the hiring process. If I have two candidates that have the same education background and one of them has experience with Splunk and I'm a Splunk company, that means that's an investment that I don't have to make, and that person has that coming in the company. So the more work that you do now to get exposure to those industry-leading tools, certifications, and those things, and you bring that with you, the more attractive you're going to be to a future employer. The second takeaway that I want you to think about is that as you move into your career and you get into an organization, every organization is going to be at a different part of maturity. And it's up to you to not only think about how do I do incident response, how do I do forensics, how do I do vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, but you might also have to think about how am I going to change the culture? How am I going to be a strategic leader and expand that responsibility to other folks other than just the folks in the security team, and think about this holistically to where everyone is part of your security team and they're all helping you drive the security outcomes that you're hired to deliver. And then finally, keep up with the new innovations, think about how security is going to change. That's one of the most fun things about this role, is that no 2 days are the same. And as new vulnerabilities and tactics and techniques come out, you're constantly going to have the opportunity to continue to learn and to be curious. So don't give up that student mindset. Be a lifelong learner. Continue to think about how you're going to keep your skills sharp and keep up to date with that. And so with that, thank you, and good luck with the competition.
Thank you again to James Perry. Pretty soon we're going to have speakers from the FBI coming up, so stay tuned. Thank you very much, guys.